Welcome to the Industrial IoT Spotlight, your number one spot for insight from industrial IoT thought leaders who are transforming businesses today. With your host, Eric Walenza.
Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Eric Walenza, CEO of IoT One, the consultancy that helps companies create value from data to accelerate growth. And our guest today is Liam Bates, founder and CEO of Kaiterra. Kaiterra provides comprehensive environmental monitoring devices, software analytics, and turnkey integrations to optimize building occupant well-being and energy efficiency. In this talk, we discuss the process for converting building environment data into tangible improvements by providing insights, modifying behavior, and automating systems. We also explored the potential for indoor air quality analytics to reduce energy consumption from building operations, which is the number one global cause of CO2 emissions. If you find these conversations valuable, please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. And if you'd like to share your company's story or recommend a speaker, you can email us at team@iot1.com. Finally, if you have an IoT research, strategy, or training initiative that you'd like to discuss, please email me directly at erik.walenza@iot1.com. Thank you.
Liam, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you. Excited to be here and chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I finally have somebody in my time zone. So I understand you're in Beijing and then not going to be here too much longer. So you've been actually in China, I think, for like 10 years or something, I guess, back and forth. But what first brought you to China?
So definitely a lot of back and forth over the years. I first came, and this is going to be a complete tangent, but I first came to China when I was 16 after watching a documentary on the National Geographic Channel about the Shaolin Temple and deciding that I wanted to spend my time practicing martial arts for about 12 hours a day and set off on this crazy adventure and ended up in Beijing and a bunch of other places practicing Kung Fu and martial arts very, very intensely. That was what first brought me here. And then I ended up coming back a lot, working on a lot of different projects and ultimately setting up Kaiterra, which has kept me also sort of back and forth between China and the rest of the world over the past few years.
Okay, well, you were using your teenage years much better than me. I think I was chasing girls and getting in trouble, more or less. That's a good use of your teens. And so you set up Kaiterra back in 2014, which I think in itself is interesting. That seems like, it's certainly a bit before this topic became kind of the topic that's top of mind for everybody that it is today. But your background before that was interesting. You were doing direction of video, TV series. So you have this kind of somewhat varied background. And then in 2014, you set up a company. And I'm always interested talking to entrepreneurs of what was it that led you to say, I'm going to tie myself to this, this high risk, stressful venture. What were the decision factors for you? What brought this to mind?
Yeah, sure. So, you said that you spent your teenage years getting in trouble. I was doing a whole lot of that as well. Generally, my type and personality is very much rebellious and not following rules. And when I see a problem, I'm just really excited to try and tackle it. So I get a lot of energy from tackling really big challenges that are exciting, and there isn't a clear answer on how to fix this problem or how to succeed. So over the years before starting Kaiterra, actually, I worked on sort of several different projects. In high school, I had a small company. We were basically like an online travel platform. I was doing that for several years. And then I got really interested in documentary filmmaking and spent several years making documentaries, which is something I found really interesting and exciting, is sort of finding issues and areas of the world that are not talked about enough and sharing the stories there so that people can broaden their experiences and understand more about the world. And that was really, really fascinating and a great way to spend a few years. And then Kaiterra started in 2014 when, at the time, I was in Beijing and my now wife, then fiance, moved to Beijing. And Beijing is known for its extremely poor air quality or high levels of air pollution. And my wife, when she was young, she had asthma. But like many people who have sort of childhood asthma, you grow up, you kind of grow out of it, it goes away. And she landed in Beijing and immediately felt the impact of air pollution, and it was sort of like asthma was coming back. So that is kind of the trigger that prompted me to start looking into what is in the air that we're breathing, what can we do about it, and really that was just a long journey that ended up going all over the world, realizing that IAQ, or indoor air quality, or just air quality in general, is not a problem of large polluted cities, which is historically what we were thinking about, and really something that's changed over the past few years as we've come to realize that IAQ is actually a problem in basically every corner of the planet. The air is really not optimized, and it has a massive impact on how we feel and our health and our performance and our happiness and all these things. So that was really the start of the journey. But yeah, we've gone a long way since then. Similar motivations, but different geographies, different sort of flavors of the same problem, etc.
Okay. This makes a lot of sense now. I'm recalling. I think I kind of blotted those memories out from mine, but I remember those years when, I think it was like my first 5 years in China. I never saw proper blue sky. Right? You just never saw like the blue that I saw when I was growing up in Portland, Oregon. And you could basically you'd tell the weather by how many buildings can I see in the horizon. Right? Okay, that building is invisible. Okay, we must have a pollution index of 300, right? Okay, that now it's 400, and it was really brutal. It's improved a lot, but like you said, this is an issue if you just are sitting in an office and you having a meeting and you close the door with 3 people in there for an hour. By the end of it, everybody's a bit tired because you're basically starting to breathe each other's CO2. And can you kind of outline for us what is the basic problem that we're solving here? And I mean, the one way that I'm kind of thinking about this is, I don't know if this is a way to think about your business, but like before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID, because COVID has its own unique set of challenges, which I'm sure you're very active in. But then there's these other kind of these other issues which are not related to viral load. They're just related to the fact that, buildings have pollution and individuals output gases. And, we have to kind of deal with that in the environment.
Yeah. So it's a really complex topic that really there's kind of different flavors of the same problem. So when we think about air quality, and this is what's really interesting, is it means completely different things to different people depending on what they have experienced. And that's often tied to sort of the local environment that they live in. So China and India, for example, have extremely high levels of particulate matter in the air outdoors. So that's, what we traditionally think of as outdoor air pollution or smog. And that has one set of impacts on our health and our well-being and certainly our happiness. When you stare out the window and the sky is gray, it doesn't really sort of inspire you to go have a great day. But there's also a completely different set of problems that also fall under the bucket of air quality, which is exactly what you were talking about, that several people in a conference room that's not well ventilated, after a few minutes, let alone multiple hours, you want to pull your hair out or jump out the window because you just feel incredibly uncomfortable. The feeling that we can easily pinpoint is, I feel tired, but there's actually so much more going on behind that. There's a physiological response that's taking place in your body because of increased levels of CO2, because of increased levels of volatile organic compounds that are being given off by the other people in the room. It's a very sort of kind of natural animal instinct. You have too many people in a small crowded space all giving off odors, and it creates stress. It causes a sense of strong unease, and you feel uncomfortable. And it's hard, we're not necessarily able to pinpoint those exact feelings, but we've all been in those situations where we just feel really uncomfortable in a space. Sometimes you start to feel claustrophobic, which is like, that's an interesting way to look at it, right? The room hasn't gotten smaller, but why after sitting in this room for 2 hours do I feel claustrophobic? Well, maybe it's all the other things that are taking place in that room that you can't see. And so again, air quality is a really broad topic, and it means a lot of different things. We are focused on the overall indoor environment, and so it's really the sort of the total of all of these different factors that can impact air quality. And as you were talking about sort of pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID, there's also been a big shift over the years. A few years ago, particulate matter So this smog in Beijing, New Delhi, places like that was a big issue. Over recent years, we've heard about wildfires. So the whole west coast of North America has had a lot of issues with wildfires. A few days ago, Vancouver, where I'm headed in a few days, was the most polluted city in the world. Australia, with the crazy bushfires, there was serious air quality issues, both indoors and outdoors there. And then, of course, during COVID, everyone got focused on, well, we're all breathing CO2, which is essentially high levels of CO2, which is I'm breathing the air that you exhaled a few minutes ago, which obviously is not great if you're looking at reducing the risk of virus transmission. So there's been a lot of different angles on the same problem, but I think what's really encouraging is that over the past few years, the overall awareness towards indoor air quality has absolutely skyrocketed, driven by all of these different problems. So we're now at the point where buildings are really starting to take this more seriously, are monitoring these different parameters on a more constant basis, and are making large changes to their buildings to actually improve the air quality.
Okay, yeah, and it's interesting thinking about the path from awareness to a solution, right? Because you could say you use sensors to monitor the situation, and that gives you some visibility. And then what do you do about it? And I guess based on what the problem is, you know there could be behavior solutions like open a door, but opening a window is not going to work if the problem is that there's a wildfire outdoors, and then
right.
you have a technical issue. So how do you think about kind of, as a technology provider, how do you go beyond providing sensors to monitor the solution to looking at, we're providing or to monitor the problem, to we're providing a solution to the problem or helping you to identify the solution to the problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And it is what is so fundamentally tricky about this is that, sometimes people think of this almost like temperature, where if the room is too hot, it's very simple. A is I feel it. I know as a human being, because humans are great sensors for temperature and humidity. I know that I am uncomfortable. I feel too hot. There's a sensor that can sort of map that feeling very well. And then the process that needs to take place is, or in that control loop, is that the temperature needs to be reduced. So the air conditioning comes on, or the HVAC set point is set to be lower so that there's cooler air coming into the space. And ultimately, you feel better, the temperature sensor registers it. It's a very simple problem and solution. The challenge with looking at air quality more holistically is that these parameters sometimes are hard to measure. The impact is also not necessarily felt immediately in all cases. Particulate matter is a great example. If you could be sitting in a very, very polluted room and not feel it immediately, but if you sit in there for 15 years of your career, you're going to have serious health impacts. There's going to be very significant negative health impacts. So some of these are short term, some of these are long term. And the other complexity in here is that all of these parameters interact with each other in different ways. So, to your example just now, you can't say that if the air quality is bad, or even if you say particulate matter is bad, open the window or close the window. Well, it's not that simple. If you're in New Delhi, most of the time you probably don't want to open the window because it's going to get worse. Again, if there's a wildfire and you're in Seattle, you probably also don't want to open the window. However, if there is not a wildfire burning at that minute, in most cases you do want to open the window if you're in Seattle, because the outdoor particulate matter levels are probably going to be lower than indoors. Because indoors you are going to have smoke from potentially combustion. So maybe there's a kitchen in the building, from people vacuuming carpets and kicking up dust. And so in that situation, you probably do want to open the windows. And so it's that's kind of where the true problem lies, just to say, okay, how do I optimize for overall air quality, or how do I optimize for the things that matter to me and that matter to the people in the space, while also having a solution that's actually sort of implementable. And that's really where the focus of most of our work is about understanding, really mapping out in a building, what is going on in this building? What are the potential, for example, sources of combustion? What are the sources of chemicals that are being off-gassed in the building? How efficient are the filters that are pulling air into the building from the outdoors, and how much of that particulate matter do they filter out. And when you have sort of a model or a map of how this building works and how these different parameters interact in this specific space, then that's where you can start to actually make positive changes. Say, okay, in this situation, we should increase ventilation because it will have a net positive effect. Whereas if the temperature is 3 degrees higher outside, we probably don't want to do that. And so that's kind of where we can start to shift from instead of just throwing a bunch of data at somebody and saying, have fun with this, try to work out what's going on with your air quality, give you something that is a bit more actionable and prescriptive.
Okay, great. So before we get into the technology, I'd love to learn more about who the users are here. So let's maybe first cover this at a high level. I mean, are you focused on commercial buildings? Are you addressing residential? Are you going into hospitals and schools and kind of these special institutions? What is the scope of your business from that perspective?
So there's, I guess to preface this, I think it's probably important to paint a picture. There are really two fundamental issues that are tied to indoor air quality, or two different ways, or two different things that people really care a lot about that are impacted by indoor air quality. One of them is the health and well-being of occupants. I mean, that was pretty obvious. Just talking a lot about how if the temperature isn't right, if the humidity levels are wrong, if CO2 is high, if there's particulate matter, you don't feel good, you're not productive, and you don't feel like you're in a good space. The other thing that people are typically very concerned about, which is tied to indoor air quality but is often overlooked, is really about energy usage and the carbon footprint. So just to share some statistics that some listeners may be familiar with or maybe not. About 28% of all global greenhouse gas emissions come from the operation of buildings. So that's a crazy number. That's almost a third of basically the world's carbon footprint is coming from the operation of buildings. And that includes many different things, the pumping air around a building, so the HVAC system, the lights, equipment within a building, etc. But typically, the single biggest consumer of energy inside a building is the HVAC system, the heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. And that is a crazy amount of the world's energy being used to heat and cool and move air around a space. It's also being run on really quite often archaic systems with very, very simple kind of control logic. Just turn on at this hour, turn off at that hour. And that means that there is a ton of waste in these systems, and there's a lot of room for improvement and opportunity to really do better and reduce carbon footprint. So fundamentally, you have the opportunity here to, in one swoop, by tackling your indoor air quality, to address these two challenges, creating a healthier indoor space and also creating a lower carbon space. So I'm saying all this to kind of paint a picture about who the users are and what they care about. So ultimately, our customers are typically Fortune 500s. They're companies that have really strong goals on these two sort of axes. So they might be going after sustainable and healthy building certifications, such as WELL or LEED or RESET. And they want to make a real difference in their space. These are typically sort of your grade A offices where you walk into the building and you're overwhelmed by how nice the space feels. And they realize that this is an important, it's essentially part of their brand promise. Come work here because you're gonna have a wonderful office. It's gonna be a space that makes you productive, that makes you happy. It's gonna be a lot nicer than your home office, and that's really a selling point for these companies. They it's a tool that they can use to bring people back into the office. So ultimately, the end customer for us is typically these let's call it Fortune 1000s. There are a lot of different people and parties involved in that ecosystem. However, from architects to the engineering firms that are involved with the design, to the contractors, and we try to work with all these different players in different ways to satisfy all their needs. But I might sort of jump into the deep end there, so maybe I'll pause and see if that was answering your question.
Yeah, no, I think that does. That helps. So, because I'm sitting here in Shanghai, and I think it's a grade B+ office. So it's a pretty nice office, but it's not like kind of a finance building in Pudong or something. and you can tell the difference, right? And I think one of the challenges in an office like the one that I have is that you've got a building owner who just, doesn't really care. And then you've got an operator that kind of does a pretty good job, but, within limits. They're not going to try to go, to the extremes. They're just going to kind of do a good job. And then you have the tenants, and we're the ones that really care, I suppose. But we're also, we're renting the building. I rent my office for 3 years. I might go switch to another office. So I'm not, am I going to invest in CapEx? Maybe, maybe not. And so you have that more complex situation between the stakeholders. I guess in your situation, maybe the operators are motivated to go above and beyond. And then also the tenants have probably a lot more leverage than me, and they're probably locking in contracts for longer periods, because if they're going to put if they're going to put 500 people somewhere, they don't want to go and move that team frequently. So is that, I guess one point would just be the price point, but the complexity of the stakeholder community, is that kind of an impact that drives where you are able to operate, or where you choose to operate in terms of buildings today?
Yeah, I think you're spot on with all of those observations. The companies for whom this will make the most sense are the companies where they have for example, it's your staff in your building, and you're really focused on increasing happiness, increasing well-being. Potentially, you're also concerned about the energy consumption within that space. And either you are the operator of the building. So we work with a lot of, say, Silicon Valley companies that have their own campuses. And so, that's really the perfect scenario, is where you have the ability to control the building management system within the building, and it's a sole tenant within that building or within that campus. And so everything is under your control. And there's a team that can work on using our platform to actually make these optimizations, implement them. So that's really sort of your ideal scenario. I think what is becoming very interesting is that in the scenario where that you just described in your office building, there is increased demand from really all parties, and it is a very complex juggling act, because the facility management company or the operator wants to be able to provide a good space for the tenants. The tenants are asking for it. At the same time, there are many aspects that are not necessarily within the control of all those stakeholders. So fundamentally, to increase or to improve air quality, you'll often need to interact with the building management system or with the air handling units to change the amount of air that's coming into the building. But that's not necessarily something that everyone has control over, or the tenant has any say over. So you might be able to install air quality monitors, but when you fundamentally find out that you need to increase levels of ventilation, you might not be able to do anything about it. So that's historically been a bit of a challenge, but I think we are seeing a lot of change in the direction of tenants before signing a lease saying, this is what you need to provide to the operator. And then the operator potentially agreeing to that and actually installing their own air quality monitors, their own assisting systems, to be able to prove, look, this is the air that I am delivering to you. I'm for example, providing 500 ppm CO2 levels into your conference room. So I'm doing my job. Now, if your conference room for 4 people has 12 people stuffed into it, that's a little bit outside of my control, and that's on the tenant. So there's a balance to be struck here. And I think you're right that it is one of the most challenging aspects, especially in the more complex building environments where there's so many different parties involved together, to work out who's responsible for what, and then work together to be able to move the needle.
Gotcha. Great. Makes sense. Well, let's get into the tech stack then. So we've got sensors, we've got analytics. I guess we have, actually I was working with Mann and Hummel, and their Claire product, helping them to assess the China market. I think it was 18 months ago or so. So, obviously Kaiterra is a partner of theirs. So this was my first introduction to Kaiterra. But you then have, you have parties that you're integrating with who are providing other technologies into a building. Can you give us kind of an overview of what does the tech stack look like? And then where is Kaiterra playing in that tech stack, and where are you partnering with companies?
Yeah. So we cover everything basically from the field, the hardware devices that are in the field. So we design and build the air quality monitors that are sitting in an office on the wall, and we provide the data collection and essentially the application layer that sits on top of that to help make sense of that data. And I think that's really the important point here, is that it's about making sense of the data, because if nobody wants more CSV files that they don't know how to interpret. And as I was saying earlier, the real challenge with this is that it's not as simple as saying, oh, CO2 levels are high, let's increase ventilation, because you might bring in a whole host of other problems by doing that. Particulate matter being one, but ozone being another. That's a really interesting challenge that we've seen. How do you balance things like CO2 and ozone levels when ozone is high outside? And these are fundamentally fixed by doing the opposite thing. So really, that's kind of the space that we are operating in. We try to be as sort of open and accessible and connectable as possible. So we think it's really important that customers are able to access their raw data and push that raw data into whatever platform they might be using if they're using another platform. There's an issue with I'm running a building and I have to use 25 different pieces of software. And so if clients are able to pull our data and pull it all into one piece of software, we're very happy for them to do that. We also think that it is really important to not forget that buildings are still operating on basically entirely sort of equipment and protocols that have been around for 30, 40 years. And so I know that there are a lot of IoT solutions that are very IoT first, and it's all about the cloud. But at the end of the day, if you want to make it, at least within the realm of air quality, if you want to make a difference, you need to be talking to the other software and the other equipment within the building. And that means going with protocols like BACnet or Modbus, at least supporting them being able to interact with them, because otherwise, really all that you're able to do is tell the customer, hey, here's a problem, check it out on my proprietary dashboard. So we're in all the products that we design, we make sure that they can simultaneously talk to the cloud so that you can analyze the data, you can get all those great reporting features, you can see what the patterns are, the long-term trends, things that a building management system wouldn't traditionally be able to do. And then simultaneously connect within the building completely locally, potentially offline if you want, to the building management system, to the other equipment in there, so that you can also do things like demand control ventilation in more traditional systems. So it's important to be able to bridge that gap between the local and sort of the cloud-enabled data analysis world. I guess sort of to that end, to sort of the other part of the question that you had is for some of the other companies that we might, or the other types of products or data streams that we might operate with or interact with. So there's a lot of interesting things that can be understood about air quality if you have other sources of data. So the most obvious ones are things like weather data. Knowing what the temperature is outdoors is going to make a huge difference on what you decide to do within the building. Should you pull in more air from outside? Should you recirculate more air and keep it well air conditioned? But there are other things that are also equally important. So occupancy data is very interesting. Even doors being opened or closed is fascinating. So I can give you a quick example on that one. We've seen, and these are really the sort of the patterns that start to emerge once you have all the data. So we've seen multiple instances in different parts of the world where there are patterns that emerge that don't necessarily make sense or look very strange at first. So in one example, we saw that there was an office, and during their working hours, the levels of, we've actually seen this both for particulates and for VOCs, but in this example, it was the levels of VOCs, volatile organic compounds, which are basically chemicals, it was extremely high in the morning, and then it slowly decreased throughout the day until it eventually got to quite a low level. And that is kind of counterintuitive, because what you usually expect is that as there are more people and there's more activity during the day, the VOC levels would increase. But in this place, they always started really high at night. And what was identified was that it was actually, I think this is an office that was connected to some sort of manufacturing facility, and they're both very well ventilated, so this shouldn't have been a problem. But during the nighttime, there was cleaning staff when they were cleaning that would leave a door open between the sort of connecting the offices to the manufacturing facility. And so what you have is actually over the night a buildup of VOCs. And when people came in the morning, they'd open the door because it had been closed maybe half an hour ago. And for some reason, the entire space was sort of already polluted. And it took multiple hours throughout the day for it to drop down. And we've seen the same thing with particulate matter levels being high in the morning because of a kitchen that was doing cooking in the morning. And the ventilation system wasn't yet running, but there was cooking taking place, and that actually caused particles to spread throughout the building so that when people came in, the air was polluted right from minute one. And so if you just, in both of these instances, there are really quick and easy fixes that you can make. If you change what time the BMS turns on the ventilation system, or if you just close a door at night when you're cleaning, then both of these problems would go away. So those are, I think, some really interesting examples of what you can see when you have more sources of data, occupancy, doors, and pattern recognition.
Yeah, very interesting. And both of those cases are cases that are, on the one hand, simple, but on the other hand, they require that particular insight, right? That, like, I mean, these companies were operating for years without realizing this. I could imagine maybe on the predictive side also, I mean, you probably have situations where during particular times, you know that, okay, right now the air quality is good, but within an hour, there's going to be a low pressure zone or just the natural flow of traffic. And so we should get as much air into the building right now, and then we should close off for rush hour, whatever that might be. But these things are somewhat local, right? So they're local to the building, they're local to that, that operating environment, which can make prescriptive or predictive analytics challenging, right? So how do you, where are we in the current state of analytics so that you can extract insights without like a really expensive training process, or maybe you still need to involve experts who are analyzing the data? What is the process to extract the insights today?
It's always a work in progress. This is something that we are always iterating on. And we really pride ourselves in being absolute experts when it comes to indoor air quality and the indoor environment. Most of our people that are working on the sales team or customer success team, they come from a very technical background. So you got a couple people with degrees in chemistry or physics, which is not necessarily typical for your average account executive. But we believe that it's really important because fundamentally, we're trying to solve problems for customers, and they are complex problems. You have to be able to understand what's happening within the building, and every building is different. Like you said, it's localized. Every building is built differently. The operations are different. They're in physical, geographically different places. What worked in New Delhi is definitely not going to work in Seattle. And the same thing in Europe, where in a lot of buildings there's no air conditioning, or there's no HVAC system at all. So that fundamentally changes how you do things, and it does make it very hard to come up with, let's say, one model that you can just throw onto every building and it will give you the right answers. So where we're at right now, and where we sort of the journey that we've been going through, is really taking that deep insight that we have, and initially having quite a high level of involvement from our team in terms of interpreting the data, helping you make sense of it, understand it. And then as we go, so slowly building out internal tools to help ourselves be able to decipher the data and identify the patterns in the data, and then ultimately productizing those so that our customers can do that themselves without actually relying on that knowledge and that expertise that we have. So really building a lot of that into the software. And that it's a really interesting and fun process. We actually have at Kaiterra, we've got an internal Kaiterra University, which is really deep training on everything environmental, and it gets very, very technical. And basically, everybody in the company goes through that. So, if you're a software engineer working on this stuff, you've probably gone through Kaiterra University, and you understand the physics of what's going on within the ventilation system, for example. And that allows people to build a much better product, and ultimately, that's going to help solve problems for the customers. One interesting example as well that I can share tied to that we saw recently was in a building in the Bay Area, and I guess without sort of getting into too many details, it's a big tech company, but fundamentally what we were able to see, and this is done through a combination of the software tools that we've built and a little bit of human interaction from a customer success manager, is to be able to see that there was essentially throughout the weekends and certain days where the offices were not actually occupied, the ventilation system was not being tuned appropriately for a weekend. So it was still often running at basically max capacity when there was absolutely nobody in the building. And this seems like such a simple thing. Like, of course, somebody would have checked this. But the reality is that, buildings are complex environments with multiple stakeholders, multiple people involved, and some really dumb things can often get overlooked. And I mean, we're talking about an amazing building here. This is recently renovated, one of the top companies in the world. Just really great property, really with teams focused on employee experience, with teams focused on workplace experience. And still, there were some really basic mistakes taking place. But you can't see that until you have the analytics that helps you find the pattern, because it's just too much data. And I remember being in a meeting with multiple stakeholders, and there was the person who was in charge of the building operations and the BMS, and the people who are in charge of sustainability and workplace experience. And we're telling them, like, guys, it looks like you're wasting potentially up to 30% of your energy by doing this. So there's a huge potential for optimization here and reducing your carbon footprint while having zero impact on employees. And they were just like, well, no, that can't be right. That doesn't sound right. John or whoever was running the BMS, like, can you double check this? And he looks and he's like, oh yeah, it's running on Saturday. And everyone's like, well, why is that happening? Don't know, but it is. And there's a lot of examples like that out there.
Yeah, luxury problems for profitable companies, right? That nobody ever looked at the energy bill and said, "Hey, can we get this down?" And, but I can.
Yeah, and I mean,
that.
Sometimes it's just nobody thought to look, or two people didn't talk to each other.
So I'm curious about the middle of the market, because it makes complete sense for you to focus on Fortune 1000, and that can probably keep you busy for a good period of time. But then you have this vast middle of the market where I'm kind of sitting today. And so what do you see in the potential? I mean, first of all, is this kind of in your roadmap going forward? And do you see kind of tech stacks that can also help in the more messy environments where the tenant feels kind of a pain, but might not be able to influence the building owner, or the building operator might not kind of be able to kind of convince the owner to invest in the capex that's required for this type of system, because I think you see this quite often where the technology is first adopted by the kind of the upper tier of companies who are willing to take the first steps, but then as it matures, you can probably start to migrate some of the tech stack to the more mass market. What is that part of your roadmap, and then what would be kind of a timeline for when this type of solution would be coming to me, let's say?
Yeah, so absolutely. And I definitely want to emphasize that our core customers, the ones that probably have, are really driving this forward in the marketplace, are typically your Fortune 1000s. But it's definitely not this is definitely a problem that we're all dealing with, and that actually we can still get a huge amount of benefit out of immediately. So I'm just taking one of our own offices, for example. is also not in a Google Microsoft type of building or office setting. It's much more humble than that, and we still manage to make massive improvements on our own air quality by having access to this data and by being able to identify some of those patterns. So it can be as simple as actually knowing that certain rooms are too hot. It can be, and then turning the air conditioning down. If you don't have an HVAC system, then that's fine. You can still control the temperature with an air conditioning system. We've installed a lot of our own sort of equipment to filter the air, to bring in air from outside to reduce CO2 levels, and this is all. These tools are all sort of available and on the market. Everything that you need to improve your air quality is there. It's just quite often you don't know what to do, don't know what the right settings are. Should I turn on the fresh air system an hour before people come to the office? Should I turn it off after people leave? All of these different things. And again, the challenge is that we're not humans are in some ways good sensors, but in other ways very poor sensors. We know when it's way too hot, but if we're a little bit too hot, we just feel uncomfortable. We don't know why. But actually, the data can tell you what the problem is. Then you can just go turn the air conditioning unit down 1 degree and you're good. So we've had a lot of success in our own offices, and we can see that by the weekly reports that we get. Over time, this is how the score has improved because we've systematically ticked off boxes one at a time. So there's the first. And one of the reports that you'll get is, for example, say like the highest impact thing that we could do in our office is to increase humidity levels because it's too dry and people feel uncomfortable. And that's very straightforward. You install a couple humidifiers, put in place a process to have somebody fill them up with water, make sure that the humidifiers are working, and you can radically improve your indoor environment in just about any office space, any building type, if you have the data and you have a system that can identify what the top areas for optimization are and tell you what to do.
Okay, great. Yeah, as we're speaking, I'm thinking we probably have one of your sensors sitting around the office actually, because we had one that we were, I think we were using this when we were doing demos for Claire.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And I think we must still have it around somewhere. I should dust it off and then see if we can, start tracking some performance here.
Yeah.
Last question from my side, and there might be some other things that you want to cover, but I'm always really interested in business models and pricing models when you have this combination of hardware, which has a CapEx cost, then you have analytics, which is kind of more of a SaaS or an OpEx situation, and then you potentially also have expertise that's required for kind of setup and so forth. So you have this